Welcome to Mission Majjhima. Ajahn.
Ajahn.
So tell us about Majjhima Nikaya number 19, the Dvedha Vitakka Sutta.
So the Dvedha Vitakka Sutta, two kinds of thinking, is the Buddha speaking about this process of moving towards awakening, and a very simple but powerful framework which he used and which he recommends for us. Basically saying that before his awakening, he divided his thoughts into two categories, those associated with sensuality, with ill will, and with cruelty. Kama and Bhayapada and Vihingsa, and put those in one category, and then take his other thoughts, which are associated with the three factors of right intention, sammasankappo, the second factor of the Noble Eightfold Path, and renunciation, non-ill will, and non-cruelty, and divided those into a second group. And he realized that whenever a unwholesome thought associated with the first unwholesome category arose, he reflected that these lead to my own suffering and harm and that of others, to both, and then it would subside. Whereas when some thought arose associated with the three beautiful or wholesome intentions of renunciation, of non-ill will, of non-cruelty, he thought this leads to neither my own harm or others, and would allow it to remain. And then he gives this beautiful analogy of a cowherd, saying that just as a cowherd would interact with their cows before the harvest at the end of the rainy season when the crops were thick, poking them and prodding them to keep them in line, so that they did not wander into the crops and eat all the crops, basically, and he would get punished. Even so, when you interact with negative mind states, he recommends prodding or poking, or at least constraining the mind from wandering into those dangerous grounds. Whereas just as a cowherd at the end of the hot season, when all the rice or all the crops have been harvested, would be able just to rest under the shade of a tree and watch the cows, just mindful of there are those cows. Even so, and I think that is literally the quote, one can interact with positive mental states just by being mindful of them and a more gentle permission. So this beautiful analogy followed by the thought that even if he pursued these wholesome thoughts in this good group of thinking, his mind would eventually become tired, and even if they led to no negative repercussions or harm in the moment, and that this would mean the mind was far from concentration. And so he gave those up, those thoughts, and descends into jhana, and again moves through the four jhanas, these deep states of meditative absorption, which issue into the three insight knowledges the night of his awakening, that of his past lives, that of other beings, passage through samsara in line with their karma, and finally to the ending of the asava, the effluence and enlightenment. And then finally he ends with this beautiful simile of a herd of deer led down a wrong path by Mara through sensual desires, by decoys of a male and female deer who he equates to ignorance and chandaraga, delight and lust, versus deer led through this dangerous marsh through the right path of the Noble Eightfold Path by the Buddha, who gets rid of those decoys. So it's this progression of the whole path interwoven with these beautiful similes, all starting with this simple directive to divide our thoughts into wholesome and unwholesome. So Ajahn, what did you find meaningful in the sutta, or interesting? What would you like to draw out?
Well, it has perhaps one of my favorite quotes from the whole Pali Canon is, whatever one thinks and ponders upon, that will become the inclination of one's mind. And it's just such good advice for realizing and questioning how are we spending our time. And the Buddha gives us a theravada Buddhism is very dualistic in certain respects, in many respects. And here in particular, we've got these two buckets that you put your thoughts. Is this a wholesome thought that will lead to one's own affliction, to the affliction of others, or to the affliction of both? Will it lead away from wisdom and away from nibbana? One can ask oneself each of those questions as to which bucket one's going to place it in. will this lead to my own affliction? Okay, think about that for a second. And the Buddha said when he thought about that he realizes if it does lead to his affliction, then he doesn't want to think that, and then, puts it in that bucket not to be encouraged. Similarly with if it leads to the affliction of others, or to both, or away from wisdom, or away from nibbana. And if it does lead away from those things, those wholesome things, then the Buddha said that he wouldn't think it. Basically, it's phrased as of biographical. So he's talking about before he attained awakening as a bodhisattva. This is how he bifurcated his way of thinking. And just that quote, whatever one thinks and ponders upon, that will become the inclination of one's mind. It's a very simple truth, but extremely powerful that, is the truth behind any habit, wholesome or unwholesome. So, and for yourself, Ajahn, anything else you'd like to pull out of this sutta?
I think one key point for me might be the fact first that 2 of the 3 factors of right and wrong intention deal with anger, just because it's such a prominent aspect of many of our experience and what we have to steer the mind away from. Ajahn Brahmali says a key function of mindfulness in daily life should be keeping one's sila and not dwelling in ill will. So the fact that avihingsa and abhayapada and avihingsa, non-cruelty, or non-ill will and non-cruelty, are 2 of the 3, along with renunciation. It just seems to point to that in my estimation. And secondly, just the Buddha's encouragement for how we work with different mind states. The fact that you can't just always, at the beginning, it is enough for him just to know that these states lead to harm, and that is enough just for, in the light of wisdom, negative mind states to dissolve. And that's great when that can happen. But he counterbalances that later with the analogy of the cowherd, saying sometimes with these negative mind states, the cows are still going to go for the corn, and you have to be tapping and prodding and careful and not let them get in there because it has real damage. So I thought that was a brilliant way of talking about how to interact with the negative mind states that come up, as is his pointing that when mind states are in a good place, you can trust them to some extent and be more gentle and hands off. And I find in meditation that's especially relevant, because if the mind is in a good place, if you're with loving kindness or it's immersed in the body, really having some faith that you don't need to be constantly steering it. Sometimes you can drop in a word or a slight intention and then just watch as it trust the cows a little bit if they're in a good spot and there's not corn around. And that's useful for meditation for me. What else for you, Ajahn? Any ways you work with this personally or things you find interesting?
One thing I thought would be nice to focus in on is specifically the causality of excessive thinking. So he says that even this good bucket of thinking in terms of renunciation, thinking about how great it would be to go forth and give up this bad habit, thinking all these good thoughts about renunciation or loving kindness or non-violence. The Buddha says there's nothing to fear in that. But with excessive thinking, the body becomes tired. When the body is tired, the mind becomes strained. When the mind is strained, it's far from concentration. But just that specific insight, and just said so nonchalantly, just with excessive thinking, the body becomes tired. There's so much insight there. I mean, I think modern science will back that up. I mean, the percentage of one's calories which are consumed by the brain just processing, is way out proportion to its size and its mass, etc., in proportion to relationship to other organs in the body. And just it's very true. And I think a lot of Americans or a lot of Westerners who are disconnected from their bodies don't realize, just sitting around watching whatever streaming content, watching YouTube or just all the digital media that one is taking in, it makes the body tired in addition to making the mind strained and keeping one far from concentration. Even if one is signed up to all the best TikTok channels about renunciation and loving kindness, etc., which they probably exist somewhere. But that thinking can make the body tired is a really crucial insight. And also just the last point, the last pericope, this quote about what a teacher out of compassion has done for their disciples, I've done for you. There are these roots of trees. There are these empty huts. Meditate, jayata, lest you regret it later. just such a good reminder. And it appears in 15 suttas, 4 here in the Majjhima, one of which we already met in the Saleka Sutta, Majjhima 8, 7 times in the Samyutta, 4 other times in the Anguttara. So yeah, there are these roots of trees. Meditate, lest you regret it later. So, and Ajahn, what is the word of the day?
Vitakka. And that means directed thought. It comes from the root tak, which means to think.
Well, Ajahn, thank you very much. And thanks everybody for tuning in.